Good afternoon, and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will focus on a new book by historian Leon Fink, Undoing the Liberal World Order, Progressive Ideals and Political Realities Since World War II, published earlier this year by Columbia University Press. Congratulations on your new book, Dr. Fink, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. We're also very fortunate to have with us Princeton University's Jeremy Edelman and NYU's Kimberly Phillips-Fine to lead off our discussion this afternoon. A warm welcome to both of you to the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I have the privilege to co-chair the seminar with Eric Arneson of the National History Center and George Washington University. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the National History Center of the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. For more than a decade now, the seminar has served as a weekly nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical findings, insights, and publications. For the past 2 years, we've been very pleased to come to you via Zoom and Facebook Live. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who helped produce this event, Rachel Wheatley for the National History Center and Peter Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. Our thanks to both of them. We'd like to acknowledge our supporters, and we welcome your support. Details about how to support the seminar are available in the chat right now. Simply go to our institutional websites. A shout out to GW's History Department for its support of this series. A quick explanation of the Q&A part of this seminar that we hope will involve many of you in the audience. Today's session will be recorded and will appear soon on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part, we ask that you please use the raise hands function in the Zoom functionality if you would like to ask a question. Once you press the button, you will be entered into a queue. When the moderator calls on you, you will receive a prompt that will ask you to unmute your screen. Please press yes, and you will, otherwise you will not be able to talk. Can start getting in line even before the end, before the discussion period starts. You can also use the Q&A function in the Zoom menu, but please do not use the chat function. Finally, please join us next week for a session on Elizabeth Samai's new book, Looking for the Good War. And with that announcement, I turn the Zoom room over to Eric Arneson. Eric, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christian. It is my distinct pleasure this afternoon to introduce Leon Fink, Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago and Senior Resident Scholar at Georgetown University's Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. Leon is a leading authority on U.S. and global labor history. Indeed, perhaps he's the dean of American labor history today, and his opinion pieces have appeared in the Washington Post, Dissent, the Daily Beast, and in these times. For the past 2 decades or so, he has served as editor of the journal Labor, Studies in Working Class History. And among his many, many books and edited collections are The Long Gilded Age, American Capitalism and the Lessons of a New World Order, published in 2014, and Working Men's Democracy, The Knights of Labor and American Politics, a book that I believe was on my comprehensive exam reading list in graduate school in 1984, a year after its publication. Today, he will be speaking on his most recent book, Undoing the Liberal World Order, Progressive Ideals and Political Realities Since World War II, published in mid-January by Columbia University Press. Leon has been a frequent attendee of the Washington History Seminar, both when we met in person and now in the virtual realm. So Leon, it's your turn in the speaker's chair. So with pleasure, I turn the screen over to you. All yours.
Thank you very much, Eric and Christian, and also our distinguished commentators, Professors Edelman and Phillips-Fine, both of whose work I've long admired, and all of you who've managed to find your way to this forum. As a regular attendee, as Eric mentioned, of the seminar, I'm particularly honored to enter my own book today into discussion. While focusing in my book, Undoing the Liberal World Order, on some of the strengths and weaknesses of liberal foreign policy initiatives during the Cold War and post-Cold War years, I feel compelled by current events to begin with an elaboration on the book's conclusion. Worldwide condemnation of Russia's naked aggression against the independent state of Ukraine shows that the muscle memory for the rules of non-aggression and positive engagement established to govern the post-World War II world is still at least partially intact. Even as the military outlook in Ukraine remains murky, the brave resistance of the Ukrainian people, together with expanding Western sanctions on Russia, remind us of the value of the liberal world order that Putin has so brazenly challenged. For the moment, at least, President Biden has recaptured a moral and political high ground for US foreign policy and breathed life into a message of democracy over autocracy. Yet, even as the present moment lends renewed credence to liberal democratic values, long tarnished or taken for granted, even in our own country, it also issues a warning left over from much unfinished business and past misdeeds. It is in that spirit of seeking a new accounting for American foreign policy in general, and more specifically for the vision and record of New Deal liberals and successive generations of progressive policymakers, that I wrote this book. Now let me offer a quick tour of the book's narrative. The book begins with a section on labor liberalism, the historical mobilization of the influence of US organized labor and its political allies that I explore in three instances: the Bretton Woods formula for economic growth, the restoration and invigoration of West German labor rights, and an initial 25-year embrace of Israeli labor Zionism. The second section turns to the contradictions of liberal anti-communism and the problem of development, a section where I focus both on Central America, especially the exceptional case of Costa Rica and India. The third and final section confronts the complexity and limits of liberal nationalist idealism that I see represented in both post-occupation Israel, that is, after 1973, as well as in the struggle against apartheid and the establishment of a post-apartheid regime in South Africa. I begin with what I call the Bretton Woods boomerang, spotlighting the post-war liberal democratic agenda built around a regulated free trade order across the US and the West. With a policy alongside this free trade of modest welfarism plus economic growth and abundance. Determined to prevent the return to German or Japanese controlled economies with their cartels and autocratic and autarkic empires, some of the loudest voices for reopening the post-World War II global marketplace came from labor liberals. No less a figure than George Marshall himself, for example, spoke to the CIO convention in 1947. And labor forces enthusiastically applauded the work of John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White at Bretton Woods. The Bretton Woods institutions, including the IMF and the World Bank, did indeed help to expand the global marketplace and spur economic growth after the war. But they notably neglected the questions of employment or competing labor markets, and thus left unaddressed the unevenness of post-war economic growth. Despite outlier arguments on the subject from Australians and labor's own push for an international trade organization. As we began to experience in the 1970s, and then more deeply by China's rise in the 90s, growth and trade without allowance or voice for workers' welfare, and indeed for the welfare of entire regions, ultimately threw a cloud over the post-war liberal economic miracle. Labor liberals played an important role as well in the German democratic recovery, or what I call the good post-war. Recently, the German Secretary of Labor at Biden's Democratic Summit extolled as German social partnership rests on two fundamentals: strong trade unions with their freedom of association guarantees, and Mitbestimmung, or the co-determination or factory councils. Both of these qualities of contemporary German labor relations, which remain the envy of labor movements across the West, derive from the immediate post-war occupation period. And the cooperation or coordination at that time of Western, especially US and British labor representatives alongside their German counterparts. The players at the time included people like Arthur Goldberg in the OSS, who even figures like Herbert Marcuse worked there, as well as German refugees like Hans Gottfeucht and Tony Sender, and grassroots coordinators from the manpower division of the occupying army under General Lucius Clay, who maintained close ties to both the AFL and the CIO. And many of his operatives indeed had past Socialist Party connections. Together, they hammered out the cooperation with the German counterparts, even amidst war-induced tension and still bitter resentments. The irony, of course, is that in this case, American Social Democrats found their most congenial room to maneuver far from American shores. The liberal anti-communism section of the book sets off the hopes of the good neighbor policy of Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy in Latin America against the concerns of the State Department with potential Soviet influence over labor and peasant movements in the region. My story begins with the wartime regime of one of several Latin American populists, in this case, Costa Rica's Dr. Calderón Guardia, whose program of social guarantees with both Catholic Church and Communist Party support tested US patience. The US thus cheered the arrival of Jose Don Pepe Figueres as president, who, after demonstrated election fraud by Calderón Guardia's party, took power during a short civil war in 1948. In Figueres, US liberals, represented here by old New Dealer and Ambassador at Large Adolf Burley, acquire what they lacked almost most everywhere else in the third world. That is, an anti-communist, democratic, even social democratic, Albert Camus quoting liberal head of state, who built on the populist social guarantees of the earlier regime, wrested pro-worker deals from United Fruit Company, and joined an alliance, the so-called Caribbean Legion, with Guatemala's president, Juan Jose Arevalo, aimed at toppling Central America's remaining several dictatorships. The Figueres-Arevalo larger project was a dream that was upended by Cold War hardliners. After the 1954 coup against Arbenz in Guatemala, liberals did indeed defend and save Figueres, but the Costa Rican formula advanced further nowhere else in the region. And like Burley himself, it generally succumbed to the drumbeat of counterinsurgency towards Fidel Castro. Here in my story, Costa Rica is a kind of stand-in for a kind of left liberal path not generally taken. It shows the fragility of US democratic commitments in the developing world, and ultimately, I think, the logic of the tragedy in Vietnam. One of the most revealing of post-war liberal searches for non-communist alternatives was surely the US alliance with Prime Minister Nehru in India. Under Truman, Kennedy and LBJ, America's best liberal minds were sent to India as in the ambassadorial slot. Chester Bowles, initially the former liberal governor of Connecticut, and then John Kenneth Galbraith, and then Bowles again under LBJ. Together, they helped make India a laboratory for Keynesian policies, boosting national and grassroots solutions, accepting a mixed economy, allowing for third world independence, even neutralism, pushing a war on poverty, the Peace Corps, and ultimately elaborate food production plans in the PL 480 loan programs. The ideal of the left liberals in India was so-called community development, an idea coming out of the TVA in the 30s, plus contributions from the idea from Gandhian village democracy, heavily supported by the Ford Foundation programs. Unfortunately, the community development idea met numerous obstacles. It never was able to achieve its goals of bottom-up development for complicated reasons. Overwhelming democracy and what commentators came to call the license permit Raj, the lack of any real land reform in India, corruption, etc. It was succeeded ultimately by a more top-down approach to development in the Green Revolution, seeds and fertilizer, as opposed to any bottom-up democratic development. And by the mid-70s, we can talk about the end of any ideal of developmental liberalism as applied even by liberals in much of the third world. In the section on liberalism on trial, I take up the case of both the liberals' biggest foreign policy victory, which I think is the move against apartheid, and its most frustrating project, namely the two-state solution in Israel and Palestine. In South Africa, the go slow policies or so-called constructive engagement of the Reagan administration towards the apartheid regime were ultimately upended by the comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, indeed passed over Reagan's veto, establishing far-reaching sanctions by congressional action that helped lead to not only the release of Nelson Mandela, but his election as president in 1994. And my story focuses on two aspects of this anti-apartheid victory, at least from the U.S., focusing on the U.S. initiative here. The political congressional campaign led by the Congressional Black Caucus, which begins under Charles Diggs and Ron Dellums, plus a broad civil society or grassroots movement with many participants. I zero in on Washington, D.C.'s own contribution to this grassroots effort with organizations as diverse as the Drum and Spear Bookstore, the Women-Centered Southern Africa Support Project, Howard University Radio, including figures like Kojo Nandi, who took his first name from Nigeria's first president, WPFW's and recently departed Askia Muhammad, all played roles in this broader civil society front. But I focus on the organization Trans Africa under former Congressman Riggs' aide, Randall Robinson, who charted and oversaw the organization Trans Africa. Robinson, once appropriately called a Brooks Brothers revolutionary, carefully tread, though embracing a international anti-imperialist ideology. In his public statements, he carefully tread a civil rights line, rallying larger political and pragmatic political support that ultimately led to a famous sit-in in November 1984 in the South African embassy. 3,000 people arrested over the next 6 months. Free South Africa movement protests across the country, including shanty towns and college campuses. Star power from Arthur Ashe to many other celebrities leading a boycott movement encompassing campuses, churches, cities, and states, and ultimately embracing not only the progressive liberal wing of the country, but even congressional Republican support from people like Senator Richard Lugar and even administration insider George Shultz. This was a huge victory for left liberal politics, in my view. But alas, there was no second act after the success of the anti-apartheid movement. Policy on Africa focused on the more neoliberal agricultural African Growth and Opportunity Act, and the movement was effectively marginalized. I look at this as showing the capacity and the limits of the civil rights creed in American political, as part of the American political vision. Finally, the book takes up is a drama in 2 acts, the problem and the questions of American liberals, American left liberals and Israel. The first, in Act 1, focus on the so-called, on what I call the embrace of labor Zionism. Israel proved to be one of the earliest liberal post-war causes in the face of open State Department antagonism. The left liberal movement led by Jewish dominated garment workers and the Jewish community in general, with people like Representative Emanuel Seller, was joined by other ardent New Dealers, including Eleanor Roosevelt and Frida Kirchway of the Nation. And together they connected particularly with the institution in Israel of the Histadrut, the labor movement in Israel that included Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, and Levi Eshkol. For these forces, Israel served as a model developing country with coordinated ties through the AFL-CIO to many African states. In this era, the underlying problem of Palestinians was considered a refugee issue. The 750,000 forcibly displaced peoples as a refugee issue, but not one directly affecting the legitimacy of the state itself. Indeed, as late as 1967, support for Israel against the Nasser threat encompassed not only what really stretched from supporters from Martin Luther King to Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, really across the left liberal board, with the exception of new Black Power advocates and the Yippies, who were among the lone dissenters at that time. But if we advance this clock just a bit to 1973, post-occupation, post-success of Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and crucially to the post-Vietnam era, we see new parameters in relation of American liberals and Israel. Jimmy Carter, as president, who 1976 next to George, was probably the most conservative candidate next to George Wallace running on the Democratic side, and who on domestic issues was considered tight as a tick when it came to fiscal policy, nevertheless adopted a progressive stance in foreign policy that combined with his own religious idealism for a political reset to recognize nationalist aspirations across the world and resolve conflicts outside big power dualisms. This helps to explain the initiative from Carter and his Secretary of State Vance and Cy Vance and Andrew Young on behalf of human rights for Palestinians, and ultimately the ideal of a two-state solution to resolve Israeli-Arab conflicts. This resulted, of course, in the Camp David Accords, initially the Camp David formula, which basically then served as the basis of the Oslo Accords of 1993 with President Clinton and Arafat and Prime Minister Barak, as well as a 2000 second Camp David meeting in 2000. All of these attempts at what was initially framed as a Camp David agreement failed. They could not overcome the issues of settlers, of the right of return, of elimination of terrorism, and it led to just continual mutual accusations between the parties. In the end, the Israel-Palestine conflict contributes to the wreckage of two democratic administrations, both Carter's and Clinton's, and raises the question: what basis is there for sovereignty where two peoples occupy the same territory? Where does the principle of sovereignty lead? How can it resolve itself? What is the right of a homeland for all peoples, plus individual human rights and a democratic voice of all inhabitants? How can all those goals be reconciled in one package? These are, in other words, a basic challenge to Wilsonian principles of national sovereignty. In conclusion, since the mid-70s, the U.S. role abroad in both Democratic and Republican administrations has been tied tightly to military interventions and or humanitarian missions, often combined, as in Kosovo or Libya. And together, they've left in this more recent period the question of economic development and welfare, left that behind as a blank slate. As a result, the ineffectiveness, the seeming bankruptcy of most liberal regimes around the world, combined with the seeming corruption, has left democratic politics all too often to the sphere of strongmen. Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdogan, Turkey, Duterte in Philippines, Trump at home. Most recently, Biden's Summit for Democracy has come and gone. But apart from demonstrating a needed military backbone against aggression in Ukraine, no path so far has been charted on a host of non-military issues: climate, world health, immigration, poverty, drug trafficking, etc. In short, if we were to enter a new age of progressive internationalism, surely we'll have to turn to some of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon. We now have two distinguished commentators, the first of which is Jeremy Edelman, who completed a doctorate in modern history at Oxford University in 1989 and is currently the Henry Charles Lee Professor of History and Director of the Global History Lab at Princeton University. His recent books include Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, A History of Humankind from the Beginning to the Present, whose 6th edition was published in 2021 by W.W. Norton, and Worldly Philosopher, The Odyssey of Albert O. Hirschman, published by Princeton University Press in 2013. Next year, Earth, Hunger, Global Integration, and the Need for Strangers will be published by Princeton as well. Professor Edelman is committed to developing higher education across the world. His Global History Lab has enrolled over 130,000 students since it began in 2012, and with partners in the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Europe, the lab extends global history learning opportunities to refugees and to fractured communities. Jeremy, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Leon. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation. Just to start echoing something that Eric said in his opening remarks, that I hope drives home the point that what an honor this is as a graduate student at Oxford. And actually, when I was studying economic history at the London School of Economics, even before then, Professor Fink's work loomed very large in my American economic history section. But it's also an honor and a pleasure to talk about the book, because I think it's one of the most important interventions in global history, though much of it is about American history and Americans abroad. It comes at a very important moment, a kind of crossroads in global history. I'll talk a little bit about that. But also the selection of case studies and how they're beaded together into an overall narrative stands as a counterpoint to some of the prevailing stories about the history of globalization, right? As if it were dominated by a logic of market integration. So the first thing to note is there's narrative, and you've heard this kind of Leon's spelled it out. The narrative puts laborism and labor-centered ideologies and policies at the center of liberal internationalism in a very powerful and important way. There are three components to that. The first is that there was a working class vision of inclusive internationalism. Secondly, that this working class internationalism was closer to liberal internationalism that was premised on open market visions than a redistributive idyll associated with socialist internationalism. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, but I think it's an important strain that fills out the arc and may address some of the issues as we get to the end of the story about why some of this comes apart. And the third is, therefore, that there was an American brand of labor internationalism that was different from, indeed, we might speculate or talk about how much it was at odds with more radical laborist and redistributivist visions of the international. And this is where and you could hear this in Leon's presentation, some of the tensions with the developmental or third worldist agendas begin to reveal themselves. The story, in some sense, it predates 1945. Liberal internationalism, from an American standpoint, we just heard the name Woodrow Wilson, gets spelled out at an earlier juncture. But it's important to recognize the prehistory to all of this, because in that earlier 20th century imaginary, that was organized around a European-focused working class that was, in some senses, in its internationalist variant, smashed by the combined events of 1914, 1917, and 1919. And that's one of the reasons why when we get to the German chapter, which I found just absolutely fascinating, and we could just spend the seminar on the German chapters, actually, though I think the Israeli chapters are going to one that get the most heat, perhaps. This is really important because the hinge to the book and why it starts in 1945 is that the rebuilding of that laborist coalition that was behind the democracies in Europe, especially in Germany, that's where American trade unionist ideologies and figures played an important role in recomposing the alliances that would support a democratic West German state. And so, in some senses, there was an American cast to the reconstruction the social reconstruction of the alliance behind the regime, even though it would really not, the Social Democrats would not really take power until much later under Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt. But they were an important key to the coalition, even if it was led by the Christian Democrats. Of course, this American brand of labor internationalism will run afoul, and you've heard this in Leon's presentation. For me, originally as a Latin Americanist, I could see this most strongly in Costa Rica. It may be the chapter that people pass over because it's a small country, it's on the periphery. But actually, if you pay attention to what Leon Fink is doing there, he's trying to say, even in a small, I think you even use the word case, exceptional case, it does allow us to explore some broader themes. But you can see the ways in which the American brand of labor internationalism runs afoul of the Latin American imaginaries, particularly as they graft onto a decolonization spirit, the agendas that one might say run from Juan Domingo Perón to Salvador Allende. And the meaning of 1973 will have multiple valences in this book, right? And so it's not just the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, it's it's OPEC, it's Allende, that whatever this 30 Trente Glorieuses meant was breaking apart by then. But you can see the seams already opening up before him. So one might say that American labor internationalism emerged as the strongest current in 1989 when the Berlin Wall falls. It's the one that's left standing when the developmentalist one has fallen and the socialist one has fallen, and thus the most poised to face the ordo-liberal push from the 1980s and the 1990s as the socialist and decolonizing variants of internationalism faded away. And yet, in my reading of this remarkable book, it was in fact the weakest of them. So I get rereading the book, trying to figure out what the puzzle is here. I sense that this is a book that's both a narrative counterpoint to the kind of forgetting of the role that American trade unions and labor internationals play. And you can hear this in Leon's own voice in this presentation, a hope for an alternative future. And yet at the same time, it's hard to see how this past holds as the legacy for the future. And this is my first, and it's an open question actually to all of you on my screen right now. So I'm including Kimberly in this one as well, which is why this narrative has been so obscured, and are we perhaps running the risk of in its recovery of perhaps even romanticizing it? That's a very general question. There are two aspects of the book I would draw readers' attention to. They were utterly fascinating. One is the role of American labor internationals, as I mentioned this, in the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War. It's really a key part, I think, a very original statement, especially the role in Germany and the rebuilding of trade unions as the pillars of German democracy. And the figure of Arthur Goldberg, I think Leon had mentioned this. He belongs in a pantheon of global history, world makers, and particularly in the management of the tensions between the occupiers and the working class. And that's a really key part of that chapter. And it remained quite strong until 1951. Here I take that passage to suggest that anti-communism was decisive. And this is what American labor internationalists, why they had a very important voice and able to play this coalition building role. I was very surprised by, and I will have a question about this, the commitment to free trade that glued this movement together. The second big takeaway, of the many takeaways, but I'll just I like to tell my graduate students, you can say that you can enjoy taking away learning things from books. That's one thing I found really enlightening. The other is the story about Israel. the ways in which nationalism, nation building, and internationalism got coiled together. And that's why the question of sovereignty remains so neuralgic and then blows up in the 1970s over the Palestinian question. And the crisis and that's where labor in 1973 is a turning point there, as well as the war will pose itself as a crisis to the labor government, to the Histrodut. And in fact, the Israeli economy is very rapidly, for those of us who lived in Israel in the 1970s in those times, was undergoing a remarkable transformation that would undermine the trade union base. The case of India it echoes some of this Israeli story as well, because it suggests what the limits of the left liberal coalition would look like, especially once the third worldist, emancipatory, redistributivist push gained force. And why Costa Rica does turn out to be an exception to the rule, what Leon Fink calls a case of one hand clapping over the success of building this exceptional case of Costa Rica while standing firm against reform in the 1950s, especially with Guatemala. And he ends with a call for thinking beyond liberal humanitarianism and its 19th century individualist ideology, and making the case for restoring some laborist cases for a new vision of a global, one might call going back to a tradition of embedded liberalism once more, in which the organized working class or labor played an important role. I have two questions just to put on the table, as well as that general one about the missing historiographic part here. One is about the material conditions of this, and the other is about ideology and idealism. And the first one is then about the in a sense, the scope conditions for the coherence of this free trade laborism, which is the part I found most surprising. And you can see this the limits of this most exposed in the discussions with India. How united was the American working class around this vision? I would like to know. And what were its conditions? In 1945, when 50% of the world's industrial output was coming out of one country, that is the United States, it was very easy to be a free trade exponent. After all, it would have meant the export of American manufactured goods and capital goods to rebuilding Asia and Europe. And what happens when Japan and Germany go from being clients to competitors? And again, that's what brings the early 70s back into the story as a turning point that removed the conditions for this labor internationalism. So one is just a little more discussion around the material conditions of this project. And the second is the idealist conditions for it. So I take the American progressivist historiography that Leon Fink is putting out here. It fared best in an era of American hegemony. And here the role of anti-communism played an important role in gluing it all together. So when that starts to fade, both American hegemony and the appeal of anti-communism begin to fade. So does the ideological glue holding it together. That's at least how I read the book. So I'd like a little more detail on the questions of anti-communism and American economic industrial hegemony. Thanks very much. And really, it's a great read. I don't know how many people are out there on the wider screen world there, but I would urge everyone to read the book, and I'm looking forward to the public debate that it generates.
Thank you, Jeremy. Leon, some questions on the table, some quick thoughts in response.
Okay, well, those Very stimulating comments. Thank you, Jeremy. Well, Jeremy kind of ran through back through my narrative, reran it, and raised questions kind of throughout. So I won't try to do the same. But I do think I think that his last question may be worth taking up first about the material limits on the rise of this initial progressive laborism, this labor liberalism of the post-war period. To what degree is it tied to American hegemony? I wouldn't entirely dispute that in the sense that certainly organized labor as a vital factor as a vector of foreign policy is pretty much exhausted by the time of the Vietnam War, and at least shortly thereafter is also a period of the decline of American hegemony in the world economy. So there's a connection there. I think it's worth, in terms of where was the working class itself, well, at least as represented through its organizations, there was pushback from early on in the free trade order by those lower wage industries like garment and textiles, but the broader, I would say, labor intellectuals and larger movement was willing to accept trade-offs in new areas of the economy and basically leave the weakest sectors go in favor of what had been such an effective cash cow of economic growth and high wages tied to trade-based industries and new technologies. So, and I should say also that the embrace of, to some extent, the market and certainly technology went beyond U.S. social democratic thinkers, well beyond the U.S. embraced that, and the struggle for efficiency and production was one that was not foreign to the labor sensibility, as I discovered. I do think obviously with the rise of Japan and ultimately China, there's a change that develops. But on foreign policy, in terms of U.S. hegemony, I guess I would point to the fact that the liberal coalition itself, including the labor movement, increasingly split over the commitment to U.S. hegemony and foreign policy, and certainly the hardline anti-communism that we associate with really both Democratic and Republican administrations, as well as Republican administrations in the post-war period up to Vietnam. There are important breaks happening by the time of really Vietnam, I think, was a telltale breakup. And so I don't think labor, I think labor itself underwent a sea change of opinion that became more critical of dictators and the assertion of force over other means. But I think that those voices, and I tried to follow them. I think they're worth following. They weren't absent, but they had less and less effect over American policy as a whole. So whether their ideology was inherently limited, I'm not quite willing to go that far and say that liberalism itself couldn't cope with a world of multipolar power. I'm not quite willing to go that far, although I agree with Jeremy that its heyday was a period, I'll give him that its heyday was a period where American, not just power, but American economic might effectively was transcendent. Otherwise, I'm trying to think where else I could jump in on Jeremy's comments. Or Jeremy, would you like me to zero in on something else that you said? Because I was writing a lot down, but not sure where to jump in.
Well, I think the question of anti-communism, I think would be interesting to hear more about, but it might be something that Kimberly points to as well. I don't. And then I had the wider question about why labor internationalism has been so invisible in the narrative of American internationalism as we rethink now how to write new global histories for a kind of post-globalization age. I was very struck by how infrequent one runs into this story and why that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, I think that part of your question, it's an appropriate question, but it also I think I maybe intentionally did an end around the question in my book, in the sense that I was looking for, as I returned to this subject, I mean, never having really written about it, but in my own thinking, this is a world that I lived through to a degree. And I'd always dismissed the politics of the liberals on grounds of their anti-communism and how what a limited worldview that was in my imagination. When I came back to look at it, I found that it was much more porous and it was multi-sided and more interesting, I guess, and ultimately more compelling than I originally gave it credit for. But, in thinking about it, if you think of outside of the Costa Rica case, where I think I deal with the question of the anti-communism in extremis and what the costs of that were. Most of the other cases, whether it's Germany, whether it's India, or certainly the South African chapter, even Israel, anti-communism is not the central player. I mean, or the communists are not a central player. In India, you could say that they were indirectly as a world competitor, but even there, I thought the liberal experiment of Nehru, which I'm really focused on, Nehru's rise and limits and ultimately fall, have less to do with the question of communism or anti-communism than they do with other inherent problems in the liberal project. So if I was to take on, obviously I made one big decision, which was not to treat Vietnam. Vietnam is kind of an elephant in the room of the cost of anti-communism. And otherwise, it's a kind of symbolic presence. But I think that there's a lot more at stake and in play than the communism, anti-communism. But you're right to kind of point to that as kind of one of the edges that I skirt. So.
Thank you. Before we get to our second discussant, let me invite those of you in the audience to participate in a little bit in this discussion. You can use the raise hand function. That's our preferred mechanism. We can call on you and you can pose your question yourself, or you can use the Q&A function in Zoom, in which case I get to pose your question instead. And with that, let's turn to Kimberly Phillips-Fine, who is professor at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study and the History Department at the College of Arts and Sciences at New York University. She holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and is the author of Invisible Hands, The Businessmen's Crusade Against the New Deal, published in 2009, and Fear City, New York's Fiscal Crisis and the Rise of Austerity Politics, published in 2017, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History the following year. She also writes widely for publications that include The Nation, the London Review of Books, and New Labor Forum. And on a personal note, I should just add that she appears on my modern US history syllabus and is invoked not infrequently in my lectures for that class. Kimberly, welcome. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me know about the class, which is great. And it's also a great honor to be here today as Leon's work was on my orals list as well. And I actually just last week referred a student to Working Men's Democracy. Upheaval in the Quiet Zone was also a really important book for me. And it's been, it's actually very interesting to see this book emerging and also some of your recent work in and around labor emerging out of the US focus of so much of labor history, and this book taking that in a new direction. And as I read the book or reread it for today, I was thinking, this, in a way, I did feel like I had to give a caveat myself, which is that rather like you, in some ways, this has not been, this is not my central focus of foreign policy. I kind of feel like I work on domestic politics. And in certain ways, actually, thinking about the book reminded me of why. I think that a lot of the challenges that come to bear when thinking about working on foreign policy raise a lot of hard and different questions about the tension between ideals and reality, about what the relationship of liberals or labor or the left, however you think about those overlapping categories, what should their relationship be to the state? So those questions came back for me while reading the book. And finally, I think, as you noted initially, the book is timely in ways that obviously couldn't have been anticipated. Whatever the outcome of the crisis in Ukraine, I think it does make clear that the world has moved out of the period that followed the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of communism and the war on terror. And that if we ever were, we are no longer in a world in which the US is effectively the only superpower. It's a much more volatile situation and frightening in different ways. And this makes the position of American left and American liberals with regard to foreign policy all the more important, and probably in some ways all the more vexed and complicated. So the book, which is really quite a remarkable book, and I actually have also started recommending this to students as well already, offers a real framework for thinking about these problems. It is subtle and rich and deeply growing out of the archives and the conversations there, as one would expect from pretty much anything that Professor Fink writes. And it offers a real framework for thinking about some of these issues. And you have some sense of the book already, but at the heart of it is the suggestion that in the post-World War II years, liberals who had come out of the New Deal moment took up the idea of how to turn their ideals at home into an international politics. They had, as he puts it, plans for a better world that could nurture democratic political life and create a secure, prosperous, developmentally oriented international financial and economic order. And the book is really focused on, I think thinking about what the working class as a whole thinks is a difficult question that the book doesn't really get into. It's not about kind of popular ideas. It's focused on a group of liberals aligned with the left wing of the Democratic Party. And it suggests that by looking at these people, you can trace a distinctive political approach and ideology, a social democratic foreign policy, one that is opposed to Soviet communism, supportive of the welfare state, of labor unions, and of a democratic politics. And at the heart of the book is a suggestion this was a real political tradition, a robust one, and it was, as you said today, a kind of road not taken. So there are a lot of wonderful parts of the book. I also was very struck by the kind of liberal idealism around free trade, which is really hard to imagine today. Although you do also note the early skepticism of textile unions, whose concerns and whose hopes to build an effective international trade organization were really pushed aside also at an early point. I thought the chapter on the reconstruction of Germany is, as Jeremy suggested, really fantastic. And I was also interested in tracing out the roles of people like Sidney Hillman, who had the whole idea of imagining accommodation with the Soviet Union and an international community focused somehow on workers' needs across boundaries and interests. but also the role that American liberals played in helping to build Germany after the war, and in ways that really emphasize an even stronger welfare state and labor traditions than came to pass in the United States, which over the same years is seeing the passage of Taft-Hartley and the frustration of some of the larger hopes, the tripartite ideals, or the ideas of continuing some of the structures of World War II into the post-war years, as well as the inability of the labor movement to continue to grow beyond that base organized in the 30s and early to mid 40s. I was very, it was interesting to be reminded of the intense idealism with left labor forces in the US once viewed Israel, despite the difficulty that this labor community had with kind of understanding or thinking about the perspectives of Palestinians, or seriously addressing the second-class citizenship of Arab Israelis from an early point, but nonetheless the extreme idealism associated with it, and with the idea of a labor-oriented socialist society. The chapter on Costa Rica is also really very compelling in the discussion of Adolf Perl. I really didn't know anything about this part of his trajectory. And then the chapters on India and on South Africa are also quite fascinating. And I actually remembered reading those. My parents, or I just to note with South Africa, that there actually had been a lot of liberal interest in apartheid, earlier in the 60s as well. And I remember my parents, who were college students at Swarthmore in the early 60s, and became involved in the civil rights movement. They said that when they got to campus, the most sort of politically interested students actually were focused on South Africa and not on the American South initially, before Greensboro and before their attention was brought to it. So each of these case studies has its own history, but taken together, there is a way in which they suggest a vision of political thinking and engagement, a vision for the world that, I think you're right, has not really gotten its due in the scholarship on labor, which is so often focused on domestic politics. And it made me think a bit. My scholarship has been very focused on the rise of anti-labor politics and the growing power of the right, which also always had a domestic focus, but probably even more was, in a pronounced way, was linked to anti-communism around the world and to a global vision of some sort. So I was interested in some of the questions about, to me, it seemed the faltering of this vision, of course, was it cannot help but be connected to the increasing weakness of the American labor movement and of whatever economic liberalism existed in the United States. How could you really sustain this politics around the world when it was so much in retreat at home? But I thought actually some of the questions that the book raised from me went beyond that particular issue. And I guess as I read, I was really thinking, how do you translate the broad claims of a left internationalism, one that prioritizes democratic government, egalitarianism, human rights, and peace? How do you translate that into an actual set of foreign policy stances? And I think that one thing the book highlighted for me is the way in which foreign policy is a problem always, and I think was for the post-war labor liberals. In a way, by its nature, it tends to privilege and prioritize the interests of the state and of elites who have power over it and benefit from it. It's really far less open to public debate and to public concern, many of its key actors not being elected figures, much of the information on which they draw being classified and not privy to this, not things citizens can access. It is often distant and removed from people's daily lives. And trying to develop foreign policy immediately places the left, or places the post-war liberals in the position of trying to influence and shape a state that had very little interest itself in a core way in working with the left. It did not have the same values. And this comes out most pronouncedly at moments of crisis. But it might be true in other ways throughout the case studies here. And as I read, I kept wondering about the extent to which the American labor liberals found themselves conscripted into a project that they might not have wanted to pursue. Time and again, we see their hopes sold out by the state on which they ultimately relied. And this is, I think, most pronounced really in the chapter on Costa Rica. But even there, it's not, I think it's complicated because Burrell became as concerned with, or was as concerned with, stopping the rise of communism in Latin America, as he was his other preoccupations. In a way, he had accepted completely the basic tenets of the Cold War. And out of that, couldn't help but come a certain constrictive vision. So I think I would have liked to hear more about some of the areas that loom large, hear about liberal idealism around Vietnam, also Cuba, and what kind of the different approach, kind of how the labor liberals dealt with, understood, thought about Cuba. I would have liked to know more actually about the anti-nuclear movement and the peace movement of the 1980s. Does that have a foreign policy dimension, or do you see it as kind of inherently defensive or not really interested in engagement? And then I also would have been interested to think about, this goes a bit beyond the time frame of the book, but why did this worldview, where were the liberal criticisms of shock therapy in the 1990s that enabled the rise of the Russian oligarchy and the steep decline in living standards at the end of the Soviet time, and the long impact of which is still being felt. So I think those were some of the questions that I had about the book, and the question of how to, I'll just pose one more, I guess, just about the anti-communism point, which is I think what really comes through in the book is how difficult the Camus' framework of how to operate without being victim or executioner. You at the start of the section on liberal communism, anti-communism, you pose the dilemma how to cope with the communist presence when it mixed with the larger anti-colonialist or national democratic impulses to which the liberals also subscribe. Should liberals side with business interests and the conservative zealots in the State Department and the CIA who demanded that any would-be ally choose up sides? And I think one of that was a question, but another aspect of it is, did they have a choice? At some point, those in the State Department and the CIA had the power. They made the decisions, how to work with them, how to carve out a foreign policy that didn't accept that at its heart. I think that's the question underneath. And then I think also the question of the I think that there are perhaps ways that just in the case of India, the presence, there's a way in which the whole the non-aligned movement makes sense as a space to operate because of the Soviet Union. Or in South Africa, the role of the Communist Party in supporting the ANC and the trade union movement, that played a central part in the undermining of apartheid, as well as the work of US activists. And I think this is, and it also on the flip side, it's part of what justified US support for apartheid for so long. How to think about liberalism and how it maneuvered in this context. So I guess I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on grappling with some of those problems. But I think, in the end, the book really read to me like a tragedy and in a sense of the narrowness of the space in which to maneuver in the world, and the limits, the problems of a politics that is so intimately connected on the backing of the US military and state. And in a way, after finishing it, I thought what is needed is different approach, and what that is, I'm not sure. But that goes beyond the role of the historian. And I think it's the accomplishment of the book that it raises those questions by sketching out and giving full voice to this tradition. It forces us to ask what could be a political vehicle for carrying these ideals forward into some hopefully better world.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to a number of hands and questions in the Q&A, Leon, some brief responses to those comments, questions.
Thanks so much, Kim. Very provocative to me. I'd love to see another a book. I think I left this out entirely, but among the many suggestions that I think are well taken would be a focus on the anti-nuclear movement and what the various contributors to that. I was obviously most acquainted with it just happened with people like E.P. Thompson, who threw himself whole-bodied into that movement in Britain. But how American liberals and leftists took that on, and to what, if any, effect in terms of tangible policy alternatives. I haven't followed that thread, and I think that definitely ought to be done. In terms of just to pick up on a few of your points, Kim, the box of foreign policy as a whole and what limits it places on really a vision on political visions, given that it's a kind of top-down enterprise almost by definition, statist. Professionals in charge, expertise, ruling, not open to no votes or immediate popular engagement. I think, if anything, it's given that fact, it's all the more interesting that when foreign policy itself succumbs to issues of vision as opposed to realpolitik, which it's doing, I think, right now to a degree. And even obviously that's been one of the long-standing tensions within even the foreign policy elite of how much its policies are dictated by national interest versus values, and when those are in play and which triumphs and how. I found as a labor historian that in some ways I felt, just backtracking a bit, that rather than moving towards foreign policy on my own, that foreign policy came to me as a labor historian, particularly when I did earlier projects on initially on maritime workers, and saw just how regulated was the world of merchant shipping by international conventions, ILO conventions, and so forth, and laws that were made internationally. Those that inevitably that is foreign policy in part by definition. And again, when I did a book on immigrants, on Guatemalan immigrants, poultry workers to North Carolina, how crucial issues of immigration law were, and even in affecting the labor conflicts that I was looking at in the poultry industry. But in general, I think you're right that the vision applied to foreign policies in some ways always a subset of domestic political visions, at least on the liberal side, and where if the domestic furnace has been banked and there's very few ideas domestically for an imaginative left liberal policies, then you're not likely to find them in the foreign policy arena either. And that, at least that's what I found in the later years, really from Clinton through Obama, in terms of Democratic Party eras, that there was not much on the shelf in terms of imaginative, visionary left liberal policy. And indeed, to come back to this issue of what seems, both you and Jeremy mentioned as the peculiarity of the the dominance of free trade ideology. Well, it wasn't just for this early Bretton Woods era, to be sure. I mean, that's what the NAFTA era was about. That's what the WTO was about. I mean, these were promoted again by liberals and the Democratic Party. So there was a vision there. I mean, it's just we now find it so distasteful and so failed as a prop that it's hard for us to can fully imagine the idealism that was once invested in it. I don't think that, at the international level, it really hasn't been until really the Bernie Sanders phenomenon and to some degree Elizabeth Warren, who raised deep questions about American monopoly abroad and the infrastructure of kind of global capitalism triumphing over any other political economic vision. So I do think, though, that just to come back to another one of your points, that well, help me out, Kim. Was there something else I could jump onto that you were pointing to?
Just open it up, since there's a number of people who have things to ask, I would say.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Let's open it up.
All right, then, from the audience, a long time.
One other thing I will say, if you don't mind, to come back to Kim's point, that I did find that there were people that we've all, in looking at the big picture of liberal exhaustion and defeat, that we've forgotten about some people who in their own day did make a difference and had a counter vision. I'm thinking about, even Cy Vance, a Brahmin who opposed the Vietnam War at a crucial time. I'm thinking about Bowles, who opposed the Bay of Pigs. I'm thinking about John Kenneth Galbraith, who I think is a really interesting figure on foreign policy, who were, in this high circle, but nevertheless raised alternative points of view. Thanks.
All right. Up next, longtime Washington History Seminar participant, Jeffrey Herf. Jeff, if you unmute yourself, you can pose a tough question to Leon.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. It sounds like a splendid book. I look forward to reading it. Mine is a conceptual question about the otherness of the rest of the world. And perhaps this is a challenge to American historians, because some of us who work on other parts of the world sometimes find our American colleagues find it difficult to imagine that there are other countries and places in the world that don't dance to the tune of the United States. So in West Germany in the 1950s, social democrats were unable to win national elections. And that wasn't because of the United States. That was because West German voters, a disturbing percentage of whom were ex-Nazis, voted for conservative governments. And so I would have things to say about Israel, but I've just published a book about that, so I don't want to raise that subject. But whether it's Israel or India or West Germany, the world is other. Even when the United States was most powerful, there were people in other countries making decisions because of what they believed and thought, no matter what labor liberals or Democrats or conservatives in Washington thought. And I wondered if you would address the foreignness and the otherness of the rest of the world and how that figures in your book.
Thank you.
I think your point is well taken, and I think that and for the purpose of this this exchange today, I short circuit that aspect. I think that one of the things I was trying to do in the book, as a little bit in contrast to a lot of international relations literature, is to allow for the agency of the partners, and often the initiative is taken not by the Americans, but by our interlocutors or the international our allies, and certainly in West Germany that's the case. I wasn't so much implying that the social democratic vision that I see in the labor relations there led itself to a triumph of the social democrats in West Germany. Even in this case, the Christian Democrats.
Leon, you have frozen. Let's give this
Catholic vision.
Good.
Am I back on? Okay,
You
sorry.
are back on.
Okay, thank you. That the Christian Democrats and their social market vision was perhaps as important or more so than the Social Democrats. And again, in these other regions that I'm addressing, whether it's India and Nehru is balancing a lot of different interests and coming up with his programs. And I mean, Kim is right that in South Africa, the agency is not just mainly from the US or the West. A lot of has to do with Cuban volunteers, even Soviet influence are playing a role in toppling the apartheid regime. So yes, it's a multipolar world from early on.
I would just add that it strikes me that the India chapter in particular is just a prime example of the ways in which American plans run up against a very different reality. And Indian government officials have their own agenda that seems to help doom some of the reformers that you talk about. It's a very, very rich chapter. Michael Novak has a hand up. Michael, please join us by unmuting yourself.
Oh, good afternoon, Professor Fink. Thank you for being here. My question is, you talk a lot about labor internationalism and the different forms of it. At this point in history, and as part of your research, are there any remnants of sort of like non-Soviet controlled or anti-Soviet socialist internationalism that still have any influence, or is that basically dead by this time? I think sort of like Trotsky's Third International or anything like that.
I guess in the period that I'm discussing, I was most taken, I guess, of all in terms of the socialist world, I was most taken with how quickly the German socialists recovered from the war and determined to move forward, in part drawing on their own Weimar experience and trying to rehabilitate the Weimar Constitution with a meaningful update. In other places, in India, the Indian socialist critique of Nehru was actually one that appealed to the American ambassadors like Bowles or Galbraith, who felt that Nehru himself was not going far enough along the road towards land reform, which had made such a difference in places, even in, say, Japan. So I think certainly parts of the socialist tradition were important. And of course, in Latin America, it was the narrowness or I thought that the clumsiness of not just clumsiness, but really vulgar anti-communism that allowed the U.S. not to take advantage of what were creative thrusts from the left, from a lot of the grassroots movements. Even the question of Castro, Kim raised, is worth re-exploring, what the options were there. There were attempts to make connections to Castro, but they were ultimately discontinued. So I think the left, and certainly in South Africa and other places, continued to play a role, but intellectually, I'm not sure I saw a place where the far left, say the Marxist tradition, has offered that much of an alternative in practical terms.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions through the Q&A that are related, and I'm going to combine. We have a retired Foreign Service labor attaché, Hank Cohen, asking, after World War II, wasn't the AFL and CIO support for the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions based mainly on the desire to restore democracy to Western Europe as opposed to economic development? And John Abbott asks you to kind of break apart the term labor in this discussion. It seems to him that the activities that you're describing, Leon, cover a relatively small number of labor functionaries whose roles in other countries owed more to the top-down political partnerships via the Democratic Party or the State Department or the OSS and then the CIA than anything that was at all vital or relevant to the life of American unions as seen from the grassroots. In speaking of labor internationalism, then, John Abbott wonders if this language implies a measure of popular support that never really existed other than its anti-communist dimensions. Admittedly, he says his thoughts on this derive from Ron Radosh's book on this topic from long ago, and he would welcome your more complex rendering of these episodes.
Well, to the first point, the ICFTU, which was this early umbrella of anti-communist Western labor movements. Yes, it was focused on democracy, but it was framed, around commitment to a what I'm calling a free trade order, a market-based order. It was itself a breakaway from the World Federation of Trade Unions, which had which all these elements had once participated, but were seen as had come to be seen as communist dominated. So I don't think it's impossible to separate the two elements of pro-democracy from their point of view and economic liberalism. On the second question, John Abbott's point about were the workers really part of this labor bloc? How much was a narrow top-down fringe? I think in the book I'm trying to. Well, I do think the labor movement had a foreign policy which mattered that we've forgotten about in the post-war years. Led by both, Jay Lovestone and Harold Brown, and even in Latin America, did have major influence. It was a top-down operation, to be sure, but it carried institutional influence. But in the book, I try to suggest that it's not. I'm not talking about the labor organizations themselves, who in my book played their biggest role, I'd say, in Germany, in really grassroots connections to German workers. I'm not talking so much, emphasizing that in most of the book, so much as I am a labor-centered vision about bottom-up welfare, economic growth combined with labor rights. This was the kind of the odd couple vision that had really been charted as early as the Woodrow Wilson era and the Lloyd George era in England, that you'd combine economic growth and trade with strong pro-worker protections. And that's a vision that I think continued with some force, through this period.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up, and I have about a dozen questions that I can't ask, so this will have to wait another day. We've only scratched the surface of undoing the liberal world order. There are many stories, case studies here that we've only, I think, just hinted at, and so I recommend the book to you. And with that, I want to thank Leon, of course, and Jeremy and Kimberly for stimulating discussion. And I will turn the session back to Christian Osterman for final words. Thank you, everyone. Christian.
Thanks, Eric. My thanks as well to Leon, Jeremy, and Kim and of course, Eric, for really a terrific conversation this afternoon. Again, please join us next week for Looking for the Good War with West Point professor Elizabeth Samay. Thanks again. We're adjourned. Stay safe and good night. Take care.